is Hope Virgo, and I am an author and mental health campaigner. I founded a campaign called Dump the Scales, and I pretty much spend my time kind of traveling all over the country, doing a lot of work with schools, corporates, hospitals, and then also do a lot of work with the government, particularly around issues to do with eating disorders and exercise addiction and disordered eating, but also looking a little bit more broadly at how we can all manage our mental health in a much kind of better way. Today, we're going to be looking at issues related to social media, which is obviously a very, very contested subject at the moment, and we all probably have our own opinions and our own views on it. Some of the content that I'm sure we'll cover today might resonate with some of you, might be quite sensitive. So I would really, really encourage you off the back of this session to have a little bit of a think about actually what your relationship with social media is like, what you can do moving forward to make it become a much more healthy place. But also, if something does hit a nerve and you need that additional support, please do think about who you have in your life, whether that's professional support, whether that's charitable support, whether that's support through your college, through your kind of network of friends, through your teachers, through your tutors, who you might actually be able to have a little bit of a conversation with about any of the stuff that comes up today. So just to kind of make sure we're all on the same level playing field, I think so often with social media, we're not 100% sure kind of what it means, what characterizes a social media. I know personally for me, I spent a lot of time thinking it was just things like Twitter, things like Instagram, things like Facebook, but actually it covers a huge range of things. Social media includes any interactive technologies that facilitate the creation and sharing of information, ideas, and interests. It could be anything, like I said, from kind of Instagram to Twitter to even things like WhatsApp as well. And it's really, really important when we are thinking about social media that we're looking at our relationship with all of those factors. One of the most probably debated questions at the moment, whenever I pretty much go anywhere and also kind of through meetings I have with the government, reflects on this question: is social media good or bad for us? And I'm sure you all have your own feelings around that, your own opinions and your own thoughts. I would encourage you to just take a few minutes now, whether you pause the video or you kind of keep watching at the same time, but to just actually start to make a bit of a list of those things for you. Start to kind of proactively think, what is good about social media and what is bad? What is helpful? What is unhelpful? What is good to look at? And what actually makes us feel really, really awful about ourselves? Think about the apps that you use, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, WhatsApp. How does it make you feel when you go on each of those apps? Does it cause you a huge amount of anxiety? Do you spend hours and hours kind of scrolling and flicking through things? Or do you find yourself down one of those rabbit holes where you're not really entirely sure what the content you're looking at is telling you or how it's making you feel, but you know that it's kind of leaving you with this kind of nagging sense where you're not really sure what's right? I think the other thing to be aware of with even things like WhatsApp nowadays is a lot of people get into quite an unhealthy relationship with it. We rely on that kind of instant communication. And if we see someone who kind of doesn't immediately reply when there's a blue tick, or we see them start to kind of write on Facebook Messenger and then they don't finish it, we're like, what have I done wrong? And you then start to overthink every single thing, maybe going down all of these internal dialogues, all of these narratives. I know for me, that kind of sense of anxiety gets very heightened actually when I might send someone a message or something like WhatsApp, they've read it and they don't reply. And you're kind of sitting there thinking, should I have said something? What should I have said instead? How have I phrased it? Should I have even just kept quiet? And then before you know it, like I said, you're back down that internal narrative. That kind of tape player starts in your head going over and over things, kind of not really sure where you're at. But looking a little bit more at the kind of research around it, we know that there has been kind of a huge amount of research that has been started looking at the relationships with our mental health, but also kind of how it relates to social media. On the screen in front of you, you'll see a number of statistics really highlighting a lot of the dangers around social media. We've had research conducted by the Royal Society for Public Health, which says that social media has been described as more addictive than cigarettes. And I'm sure, again, I'm not the only person who has had that tendency in the past to actually find that kind of need to keep going back, to keep checking, to keep refreshing those pages. We've also seen that rates of anxiety and depression in young people have risen by 70% in the past 25 years. And whilst we cannot categorically say that, yes, that is directly related to social media, we know that social media in some areas has really exacerbated a lot of these issues. Cyberbullying has also grown, with now 7 in 10 young people saying they have experienced it. And I think, again, it's a really kind of dangerous cycle to get into, isn't it? That kind of, you remove yourself, you're one step removed, so you feel like you can kind of comment and question things online. And whilst we think like it's harmless banter maybe some of the time, actually quite often it can be really triggering and really detrimental for a lot of people out there. And then we have also seen these huge links between social media and eating disorders. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one who's kind of been made more and more aware of this over the last couple of years. When we look at social media, particularly over the pandemic as a starter, we've seen a lot of these kind of wellness influencers popping up. These people who have millions of followers and perhaps a blue tick on something like Instagram. So we think that what they're saying is 100% true. But actually, in so many situations, a lot of that information is really, really dangerous. It's unscientific. It's not accurate. If you're getting your fitness advice, your diet advice off something like Instagram or TikTok, I would really encourage you to actually look at the source of that information, to really kind of look at where they've actually pulled that from, and to ask yourself, are they doing it for their gain, or are they doing it to actually support people around you? I'm sure that wellness influencers don't mean any harm when they post a lot of the stuff they post, but we just have to be aware that actually it can be quite triggering and quite dangerous for other people out there. Also, with regards to things like eating disorders and social media, we see a lot of these kind of before and after shots popping up. Whilst you might think, again, that's harmless, or maybe you think it's quite upsetting when you see, for people with eating disorders, it creates this really competitive narrative, this kind of idea that in order to have an eating disorder, you have to have this one particular look that certain way, be that certain type of person. And it often stops people reaching out for support. The other thing that we need to be very, very aware of when it comes to things like eating disorders and social media is actually that connection to body image. Again, we cannot say kind of categorically that bad body image causes an eating disorder, but we live in this society where we get so much of our self-worth from our bodies, from what we look like, and things like social media really exacerbate a lot of those issues. I'm sure some of you, maybe like me in the past, have spent times kind of scrolling on Instagram, kind of looking at pictures of people who are a certain size and kind of idealizing that, maybe zooming in slightly on someone's body, comparing your body to theirs. And it can be very, very toxic and quite a dangerous place to get into. I think, again, obviously we cannot kind of completely stamp that out. We live in a society, don't we, where we compare, we contrast, we judge a lot. And social media has just made that so much more accessible. But we need to be very, very mindful of actually the impact that those comparisons are really having on us on a day-to-day basis. And then the other thing just to kind of flag, which links, I think, to kind of the last couple of years, but also to that body image aspect, is the amount of time people are spending on social media during the kind of pandemic. I think, again, a lot of people's social media usage has skyrocketed, particularly at the start of the pandemic, and we didn't have a huge amount to do. But a lot of the information that's being shared can, again, be quite toxic. You think back to when the pandemic started, and pretty much every single time you went on Instagram or TikTok, there was another exercise thing kind of streaming, suggesting like a challenge, something like that. And again, it could be something that you think is really harmless, but a lot of the time it does make us question what we're doing. We get a lot of our self-worth from sharing these certain highlight reels online. And I know that sometimes in the past, I would have found it extremely triggering to see that. Also would felt kind of tempted to go back to those behaviors, to maybe try and get that quick fix, to try and make myself feel momentarily better, knowing that it probably doesn't really solve anything, but I'm just going to try it and just see what happens. I think, again, over the last year with things like COVID, we have seen, like I said, more and more time just spent scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And a lot of people have got into quite an unhealthy relationship, kind of not really sure what to do with their time. So sharing things over and over. And again, in some situations it's harmless, but we need to make sure that where we're coming from with all of this is that we have really, really positive mental health, that we are in a space where we can kind of own our own bodies, kind of have that self-esteem kind of nailed to a certain extent, so that we're not actually triggered every single time we look on these apps to go down that comparison and that internal narrative approach. But it isn't all bad news. And we know that in some situations, social media can be a real positive. It's great for things like connection. And I think, again, we've definitely seen that over the last 2 years, kind of going from lockdown to lockdown to lockdown, that kind of connecting factor. It's also fantastic for things like sharing news, for campaigning. And I know for me, actually, with a lot of the campaigning that I do, kind of using social media as a bit of a platform to share that message, to get those key ideas out there is really, really important. But it's about finding your tribe on these places. It's about finding the things that you want to look at, actually finding those people that you relate to, people that you kind of share those experiences with and have that kind of camaraderie with, people who just kind of understand maybe where you're coming from. And I think for me, actually, that has been a real positive with things like social media. You kind of connect with people who maybe you would never have connected with before. And I think particularly over the pandemic, actually having those new connections created from a kind of recovery perspective with regards to kind of managing my own mental health, but also looking a little bit more broadly at it. But the most important thing when we're thinking about things like social media, it's about how it's actually making you feel. It doesn't matter what the research says, that's the reality. It doesn't matter what you're told or what I sit and tell you today. I could go on and on about all of the negatives of social media. I could tell you how to manage it, how to make it positive, but it's about how it makes us feel inside on that day-to-day basis. When you're using things like social media, how do you feel? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel sad? Do you feel happy? Do you feel angry? Does it influence your mood when you're kind of sitting there scrolling, or you're waiting for someone to respond on something like WhatsApp? Is it interfering with your day-to-day life, kind of stopping you going out and about with your friends, kind of stopping you being present in that moment? And what ideals is it planting in you? What are you actually feeding your brain with when you're looking at things like social media? And I think, again, it's challenging, isn't it, at the moment? There's so much controversy out there in the world. There's so much hurt and so much pain. And while social media can be a real positive for sharing kind of those real life stories and getting that message out, what's it actually doing to us? How is it making us feel on that kind of day to day? And I think particularly with those kind of stuff that we're feeding ourselves with, are we looking at those accounts that make us feel rubbish, but we're still going back to them time and time again, getting stuck down those kind of various rabbit holes? I know for me that my relationship with social media has pretty much been extremely up and down. There are times when it gets particularly challenging and when I feel myself slipping down into that kind of dark addictive cycle where I kind of feel this need to go on all the time, kind of in that comparison factor. But there's also those times when actually I've been very kind of regimented on what I'm doing with it. I noticed actually recently, just after Christmas, that my relationship with things like Instagram was probably getting slightly out of hand. I realized that actually I was spending quite a lot of time kind of scrolling and scrolling. And whilst I often justify this because of the work that I do, because of the message I want to get out there, actually sometimes it can become quite a dangerous and toxic place for me. So for me, my way of dealing with that was to kind of input this kind of 20-minute kind of regimented kind of rule around, actually, I could only go on it for that amount of time. I couldn't scroll. When I was going on it, I had to go on it with a purpose. And although I would say it's been challenging in places, actually for me, having those kind of plans in place really helps me to actually see, actually, this is then having a much more positive impact on my well-being more broadly. But again, it is something that you have to keep in check. I think all of us, and although I'm going to kind of talk to you about some kind of top tips for really managing your own relationship with social media, it's about taking ownership of that yourself. It's about understanding what your relationship is like with social media, how it's making you feel, like I said, and kind of working out actually what this could look like moving forward in a positive sense. I could sit here and tell you kind of, I don't know, an A to Z plan of how to make sure you're doing it in the right way. But actually, we need to work out what works for us in that moment. So looking a little bit more at kind of some of the signs to really be aware of when we're looking at kind of our relationship with social media and those areas of things that need to really be checked. So if we're spending more time on social media than with our kind of real world friends, that is a red flag that something's not quite right, that maybe that dynamic is kind of come a little bit skewed. And I know, yes, it's hard at the moment, particularly given the year that we've had. I think a lot of people feel kind of out of sync. We might have a lot of kind of people with social anxiety, not really sure they want to kind of interact again. And obviously, if you're someone who's having to kind of shield or still isolate, or maybe you've got a lot of fear around the pandemic and things opening up, it can again become quite a challenging space. But it's about finding sometimes other mechanisms, other ways to communicate with people. Another sign is that if you're constantly in that comparison with others on social media, Maybe you have low self-esteem yourself, or this really negative body image. And if you're starting to develop patterns of disordered eating, whether that's trying out new diets, whether that's maybe starting to exercise, maybe that's kind of obsessing and calorie counting, that again is a red flag that actually that social media is probably having quite a negative effect on your mental health more broadly. If you're sitting in your lessons, or you're sitting at work, or you're kind of out with your friends having a meal and you're thinking about, when can I get on social media? What's everyone else sharing? What can I next look at? Again, that's a sign. You probably need to have a little bit of a step back from it. I know something for me, and something that I'm sure others do as well, is you kind of get into that habit where every single spare moment you have, you go on social media. That even includes when you go for a wee. You kind of sit down and maybe you start scrolling. And whilst, yes, it might seem harmless, but actually when we're thinking about social media and having to go on at every spare second we have in our day, there's probably something that's a bit of a red flag again, that maybe that relationship isn't 100% safe. It also might have an impact on our sleep. Maybe in the night, if you're having a bad night, you get up and you scroll again. And then before you know it, you're kind of hours into this rabbit hole on social media. And in some situations, it has been known to kind of worsen those symptoms of anxiety or depression. And again, like I said at the start, we cannot categorically kind of say that kind of causes anxiety and depression, but we know that it's a contributing factor. We know that it can exacerbate a lot of these issues as well. So kind of take a little bit of a look at that list. And I want you to think really, really carefully about your own relationship with social media. I'll just give you a second just to kind of look through that list properly. Obviously, feel free to pause the video if you need a little bit more time. But actually just think about actually where maybe in the last month, the last 2 months, this has really felt like an issue, whether it's been the sleep problems, whether it's been the anxiety, whether it's the distraction, or whether it is kind of going on at every single second you have spare. So what can you guys do to try and manage your own social media kind of usage in a much more healthy way? And again, like I've said multiple times, a huge part of this is about taking ownership of actually your relationship. I can tell you all of this sort of stuff, and I would really, really encourage you to think about it, to act on it. But you need to think about actually that whole kind of feelings aspect about social media, and actually also bring in a little bit of discipline around that, kind of managing it and understanding it and unpacking it for yourself. So the first thing to really think about is taking ownership of the times of day that you are looking at social media. If social media tends to cause you a huge amount of anxiety, maybe don't look at it just before you go to bed. Or if you've had a challenging day and maybe you're feeling like that internal narrative has got really, really toxic in your head, maybe try and take a little bit of a step back and kind of think to yourself, actually, I'm not going to spend my evening scrolling on things like Instagram or TikTok or in that comparison factor, but I'm going to maybe watch something on the TV or journal or have that distraction in place. And again, I know that I do that at times. I have a bad day and I scroll and it always makes you feel so much worse, but yet we still keep going back. We still keep doing more of it. And I'm never 100% sure why we get down those cycles, but actually we need to be proactive in taking ownership of that. For me, it's about maybe putting my phone in another room so that I'm not tempted to just kind of pick it up and scroll. But again, it might be kind of creating those rules around things. If you've got people that you follow that are really, really triggering or you're just finding not very helpful, muting them can be really helpful if they're your friends, if you don't feel like you can unfollow them, but also going through and kind of diversifying what you're looking at. Look at kind of accounts that inspire you, that make you feel excited. Look at kind of accounts that maybe are really different and actually flood your feeds with so much different stuff. When you're looking at images online, particularly from maybe influencers, ask yourself, who has created this? What digital manipulation has been used? How is this trying to make me feel? And who does it actually really benefit? I think so often, like I said at the start, like we take all of this stuff at face value without really realizing that a lot of the time there's like this underlying message going on, this underlying kind of push that maybe other people are kind of fighting for as well. Just being aware that everybody has their own story in all of this. It's important, again, to be mindful of time. I kind of mentioned the times of day, whether it's bedtimes, whether it's trying not to look at it at night, things like that are really, really important. But actually just being mindful of how much time you are actually spending on social media compared to other things in your life. Sometimes what I do is I make a list of every single thing that makes me happy. And I guarantee that actually social media never, ever features on that list. Yes, it's fun to look at every now and again. Yes, it's great for communicating, campaigning, connecting, but actually kind of making sure that we're filling our time with that stuff that actually is good for our well-being, that stuff that makes us feel really happy. And for some of you, that might be things like social media, but it's about just making sure that if it is, that you have that variety of options available. It's important that we have mantras available, like to hand in our heads. And when I talk about mantras, I basically mean these kind of positive affirmations, these things that we tell ourselves. I think, again, when you're on things like social media, you can spend so long kind of scrolling, comparing, judging. And before you know it, you've kind of created that internal narrative. And I know that some of you will completely relate to those feelings that there is something kind of categorically wrong with you. And maybe by looking at social media, kind of zooming on those images, like constantly comparing and contrasting, it fuels a lot of those narratives going on. Have those mantras in your head so that you can interrupt a lot of that that narrative, kind of interrupting that thought. And it isn't necessarily about interrupting it with a positive affirmation, but it's about having that kind of way that you can just be like, right, I'm gonna stop looking at this. I'm gonna think about football or shopping or sports, something like that, just to offer that kind of space elsewhere. I think, again, with mantras, it's really important to kind of keep reminding yourself. And again, everyone says it, and we don't always 100% believe it, I think, but we know that social media is basically someone's highlight reel of their life. It doesn't paint always this accurate picture. Firstly, I would encourage you to look at people who are really honest about things, who are painting that accurate picture of life. But again, having those mantras, reminding yourself that actually people are creating this kind of highlight reel, and this is how things are looking, and this isn't 100% accurate, like all of that sort of stuff. Just knowing that is really, really important. It's about creating your feeds in such a way where, like I said, we're looking at diverse content, but we're also, every time we click on the explore bar, or every time on TikTok another video flashes up, that actually we're seeing stuff that's positive for our well-being. It isn't just about flooding yourselves with these kind of positive memes and hashtags, because I think, yes, they all make us smile. Maybe sometimes they kind of give you that kind of rush of endorphins, but they don't really change things in the long run. So it is about trying to kind of rewire what you're looking at, kind of rewire your thinking as well. It's about making sure that you have fun activities to do in real life. And I know, again, like I've said, for some of you that might feel slightly harder, but it's about trying to think about what can you do outside of that social media. Maybe when you go for a walk, create a rule that you're not going to look at your phone. Or one of the reasons I love going to the cinema is you cannot look at your phone in the cinema. So actually, again, having that stuff in place, having those activities. I think the more kind of we're out and about and we're doing stuff, the less need we have to actually want to go to our phone and have that look, have a read of things. And then another really, really helpful thing that I do is actually putting all of my social media apps into a particular box on my phone, kind of having that space for them, because it just offers that kind of one step removed from you just immediately opening it. Alongside that, I think, again, so often trying to find a way to maybe not have your notifications constantly flashing up. Because again, if you've got a notification flashing up, you're going to immediately look on your phone. You're then going to spend probably ages kind of scrolling and scrolling. I know that I'm not as like that disciplined. So if I get a notification, I can't start scrolling a lot. But it is about kind of creating that way where it just makes it slightly harder for us to look. And I guarantee when you kind of get to a space where you've reassessed that, perhaps where you've kind of looked at actually the wider impact on your well-being, yes, at first it might feel slightly uncomfortable. It might feel a little bit out of your comfort zone, out of that kind of going to this kind of like place of uncertainty around it. But actually, the more we are doing that, the better it will be. And you will start to see all of the positive benefits of it. You'll start to probably feel maybe better mentally, but also feeling like actually there's other stuff out there. And then you'll get this like less of a need every single day to keep going back to social media, to keep looking at things as well. But if anything has come up for you today, or you want to look a little bit more into this, there's a couple of places on the screen again that you can kind of go to and get that additional support. But I would really, really encourage you, off the back of the session today, to maybe just make 3 or 4 kind of action pointers to just think about it. It might be that you start off by thinking about actually, how does the social media make me feel? How am I feeling when I'm looking at it? What images, things like that. And then maybe a second action is like creating your feeds, kind of taking that time. It could be that you sit down with your friends and you do it all together, making a bit of a fun of it. Or maybe as a group of friends, you set those time limits on yourselves so that you have that space where actually maybe you're all doing it together, kind of in it, trying it out, seeing how it's affecting you, seeing the positive impact that maybe reducing that time is having on your mental health. And if you do feel like all of this just sounds so difficult and so challenging to do, and you're not even really 100% sure where to start with it, I would really encourage you to actually have a conversation with someone. Find someone at college, someone in your network, one of your friends, an adult, anyone who maybe you can just think, actually, my relationship with social media isn't great. Can I have some help on how to manage this? Or could you maybe check in with me on a week-to-week basis as I start to kind of put in a couple of rules and a bit of guidance around what this might look like for me? But thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you found it interesting and insightful. My contact details are on the screen. So if there is anything that's come up for you or something that you want to kind of pick my brains in a little bit more, do feel free to kind of reach out and get in touch as well. But thank you everyone for listening.